Welcome, ladies and gents. Chris Andre here. You can find me at BetBoxing on Twitter for boxing-related tweets, or you can subscribe to the channel, click that notifications button, get a new notification whenever a new video is uploaded. I wasn't planning on bringing another video tonight. The next video I was going to bring out was a review of Josh Taylor's fight, undisputed fight against Jose Ramirez. Terrific fight of the year candidate. If you're interested, I've put up a very detailed technical breakdown of that video, so please check it out. But this video is about some unbelievable breaking news, and then I'm going to pose a question that no doubt is going to cause some controversy and divide opinion over here. So the breaking news, which has taken the boxing world by storm, is that Manny Pacquiao has announced that on August the 21st, he will face Errol Spence Jr. in Las Vegas, Nevada. Unbelievable development at the ripe old age of 42 years old. If he was to win this, and there's no doubt that Errol Spence will be the favorite here, but if he was to win this, what would this do for Manny Pacquiao's legacy? So I put out a tweet. It was a Twitter poll where I've asked, considering that Pacquiao came from a smaller weight division compared to Floyd, if he was to beat Errol Spence, do you believe it would take his pound-for-pound legacy to a greater height than Mayweather's? Yes, higher, because he's reached higher heights. No, Floyd achieved more. Or no, because Floyd beat him. So far, after just 48 votes, so I'll put the poll in the description box of this video for you guys that have got Twitter. You can also vote on it. 68.8% have said, yes, it would. He's reached higher heights, or would have reached higher heights. No, Floyd achieved more, 14.6%, and no, Floyd beat him at 16.7%. And I've had a whole bunch of people write in. Rachel, I don't know if, you know what, to this day, I don't know, is it Two Lives, Twolives? I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, but listen, I love Rachel. What a diamond of a woman, just quality. She wrote, he's already there for me, hashtag best of his generation. Said Master wrote, in my humble opinion, his legacy is already greater than Floyd's. He's achieved far more in many more divisions. Silly Lucas said, I think there's a workable argument that he's above Floyd as it is, though I'm not certain. He's putting one of the greatest single performances, him putting one of the greatest single performances in boxing history, considering age and context, on the table would put him well clear. Reece Donnelly said, if Manny wins this, he's beat the best for 3 generations, with every single opponent being bigger than him. Iggy wrote, but Floyd is fighting the great YouTuber who is bigger and so much younger than Floyd. Obviously, that's a knock at Jake Paul and the current opponent that Floyd's facing. Sean Binnington said, does remarkable for his age, but to beat Spence would take something spectacular. Joe Briggs said would be one of the all-time great post-prime wins. Duran Barkley tier. Ed wrote, I'd like to see Spence win, to be honest. I want to watch him and Crawford go at it with perfect records intact. Let me know what you think. What's your position on this? Now, I guess there are a number of different ways of analysing this. So let's talk about some of them. Manny Pacquiao, some people will argue. Max Kellerman, for example. Max Kellerman came out and said he believes that Manny Pacquiao is a better pound-for-pound fighter than Floyd Mayweather. His argument is, look, he's smaller. If they were the same size, I don't believe that Floyd beats him. So he's the better pound-for-pound fighter. Now, the logic there, I can understand the logic, right? The logic there is, look, let's say somebody like the great Andre Ward, light heavyweight champion, undisputed. Or was he undisputed? Yeah, I think he was. A super middleweight, he was undisputed, right? Regardless, unified, undisputed, whatever. Undefeated, superb, super middleweight, and light heavyweight. If he went up to heavyweight and he lost to a mediocre heavyweight, let's say he lost to Robert Helenius. Helenius was too big, too strong. He stopped him. That wouldn't make Helenius better than Ward pound for pound. It just meant that he reached a point where the guy was too big for him, right? That's the logic that Max Kellerman's using, I assume. If you're talking about literal ability, pound for pound has no foundation to it, no basis to it. I agree with Tyson Fury when he says that. Because if you look at capabilities, if you've ever seen Brian Viloria use a skipping rope, you'll be amazed, right? But Brian Viloria isn't some unbelievable fighter with an unbelievable legacy, but he's got this unbelievable agility and his size plays a role. He's not going to have that same agility if he was a light heavyweight, right? You've got Gary Russell Jr. It's easy to say if Garrett Russell Jr. was a heavyweight, he'd beat the other heavyweights. Well, obviously, because of that hand speed, no one would come close to him. But if he did put on weight, he wouldn't have that hand speed. There are physical trade-offs, right? So what you tend to do when you're discussing pound for pound is how dominant someone is in their own weight category compared to their peers. You know, that's how you have to analyze it. So from that perspective, is Manny being the smaller guy and having gone through more weight categories a bigger achievement than what Floyd did? Now, Manny has lower lows than Floyd, of course. He has 7 defeats, 62 wins, 2 no contests. Now, when you consider that he's had 7 defeats, some of them are etched in the memory because they're terrible blemishes. The type of knockout he faced, the knockout defeat he faced at the hands of Juan Manuel Marquez late in his career, many people will never forget that, particularly as Floyd was so dominant over Marquez. And Manny always went life and death with Marquez. Not always, but there was a controversial decision in there too. Now, the counter argument to that is, look, Floyd was the much bigger man than Marquez too. He came down a division and Marquez went up a division, and Floyd still didn't make the weight. He was like 2 pounds above the agreed weight. So there was just such a vast discrepancy in terms of size. If you look at the other comparable opponents, whether you're talking about Miguel Cotto or Ricky Hatton or Oscar De La Hoya, it was Manny Pacquiao who was a lot more destructive. Shane Mosley. Manny Pacquiao was the one that put in the performances that made you go, wow, in comparison. Having said that, so the lower lows were for Manny though, whether you're talking about Marquez or Jeff Horn. I know some people say he won that fight. I feel that Jeff Horn legitimately won that fight. I genuinely do. Yes, he was hurt late on, but that aside, overall, holistically, I thought Jeff Horn legitimately won that fight. The point is, there have been some decisions that he's lost that, some fights rather that he's lost, that some people feel like, it's not a good look on his record, so to speak, compared to Floyd. Floyd was perfect in reality. Many will say, look, he lost that fight to Castillo, the first fight. But that aside, Floyd always seemed to find a way. Now, many people will say, look, one thing about Floyd, though, he did fight guys that weren't always at their prime. Maybe they were a little bit past their best, and they'll talk about Manny, they'll talk about Cotto. And while that may be true, you have to understand that Cotto and Manny did then go on to have brilliant wins in their careers. I mean, just look at Manny Pacquiao now. Talk of him fighting Errol Spence. Well, since losing to Floyd Mayweather, he's had a whole bunch of other great wins. Timothy Bradley, Jesse Vargas, Adrian Broner, Keith Thurman, Errol Spence. These are fantastic victories. Sorry, not Errol Spence. I'm getting ahead of myself. But if he was to beat Errol Spence, these are fantastic victories on his record, right? So he can't be completely washed. Now, when they fought each other, there was a decline, though, in Manny. Manny was a sort of fighter who relied on his physical prowess. He was a force of nature, incredible tempo, unbelievably fast hands and feet, and would overwhelm you with that. Well, in his prime, or in his younger days at least, he was throwing 1,000 punches per fight. Now, that's not necessarily to say that the more volume you throw, the better you are, because he became more of a thinking fighter as he got older. But he was still at his most frenetic. By the time he fought Floyd in the 3 fights preceding that, he was averaging, I think, just over 600 punches a fight. So you're talking about pretty much like a 40% reduction in output. By the time he then fought Floyd, on the night that he fought Floyd, he averaged just over 400 punches a fight. Now, if you're talking about output in that regard, that means there would have been a 60% reduction in that period of time. Now, much of that is down to Floyd, because just like Klitschko when he fought Tyson Fury, Fury wasn't there to be hit. So a lot of people say, well, Klitschko just didn't let his hands go. Why? So you could argue that Floyd did that to Manny too. And that's one thing that stands out for people, the fact that Floyd was so dominant against Manny Pacquiao. Now, in terms of rounds, I don't actually think it was that wide. I thought it was 7 rounds to 5 or 8 rounds to 4 to Floyd. But it was one of those scenarios where I feel like he built up a lead, and then Manny was trying to catch him, and you knew that unless Manny did something special and dropped him or hurt him, he was never really going to catch Floyd. So the way I've always tried to explain this when I say I had it 7-5, maybe 8-4, but it was comfortable for Floyd, is kind of like the Teofimo Lopez-Lomachenko fight, although Lopez had many more scary moments. But to use another sport as an example, imagine you've got a football match and one team's 3-0 up after 79 minutes, and then the home team score in the 80th and the 88th. well, now they've lost 3-2 and it looks like a really close match. But in reality, the team that was 3-0 up with 11 minutes to go in the game were pretty comfortable. And that's how I kind of see that fight. And so many people will see the head-to-head between the two as a blemish on Manny Pacquiao and say, yes, okay, he may have been past his best, but Floyd wasn't at his best either in terms of age. And it just wasn't that competitive. That's why it wasn't considered a great fight. It was considered dull because Floyd was able to nullify much of what Manny was doing by boxing off the back foot and being what many people would call negative. Now, some people will say, well, look, at the end of the day, Floyd, like I said, he'd aged too. And the reality is that Floyd has a style or skill set which ages better than Manny's. And maybe that's what makes him better. Of course, the counter argument to that is, what if you're judging peak and you're not judging longevity? If you're judging peak, then you've got to look at Manny at his best compared to Floyd at his best. It doesn't matter if Floyd aged more slowly than Manny did and his style carried. Again, to use football as an example, if you've got a footballer like Andrea Pirlo, who's a very technical player, but wasn't strong or fast, he continued to play at a high level into his latter years, older years, twilight years in footballing terms, because he was reliant on his technical skills. Whereas you could have a guy who was, you know, an explosive athlete, unbelievable at the top of his game, and yet he would age more quickly because as he lost those attributes, he was no longer the same player. It doesn't necessarily mean that so say, all right, different position, but someone like Obafemi Martins, if you remember him, when he broke onto the scene, lightning quick, as he started to age, he was no longer the same player because he was reliant on that. Well, if you're judging peak for peak, you might prefer Manny Pacquiao. You might look at him at his peak and say, look, the way he moved, he was so destructive, he was this or that. Or you might look at the fact that Floyd appeared to have been untouchable. Maybe that's what you focus on. You might focus on the head-to-head. Let me know what you think. Maybe you're looking at the best wins. Maybe that's another way of doing it. Who's got the best wins? Because what are Floyd's best wins if you're considering the fighters at the time he fought them? So Canelo Alvarez as a name is probably his biggest win, right? But Canelo, even though he was 42-0 back then, because he didn't have an amateur career, he was sort of learning on the job. He was green. He was drained in that fight. You know, he had to come in at, was it 152.5 pounds? He wasn't even allowed to come in at 154. It wasn't really peak Canelo Alvarez. So is that really his best win? You'd have to say that Oscar de la Hoya win was a superb win. That's what really made Floyd a superstar. Ricky Hatton was 43-0 at the time. You know, that's a great win, but Ricky was smaller, just like Juan Manuel Marquez was when he had to go up and Floyd had to come down, like I said. So what was his best win? I think you'd have to probably go back. I mean, the Arturo Gatti performance was unbelievable. But Gatti maybe wasn't as, you know, skilled as some of these other fighters. Zab Judah, he was a quality fighter. Maybe it was the Castillo rematch. Maybe it was, oh gosh, my mind's gone blank. Diego Corrales. That was a fantastic performance and win. So what is the best performance of Floyd's career? Whereas many people will be more in awe, I guess, of Manny Pacquiao's performances at his peak. But here's the thing. Here's the catch to this all. If Manny still went on to achieve the things he achieved and to beat the likes of Broner, Thurman, Matisse after losing to Floyd, and Timothy Bradley and Jesse Vargas after losing to Floyd, well, then maybe Floyd's best win was Manny Pacquiao, because Pacquiao really wasn't that washed, you could argue. Okay. Now, one of the criticisms that Floyd gets is that he, like I said, he'd pick and choose. And perhaps one prime example of that is Amir Khan. Amir Khan stylistically could have caused Floyd a lot of problems. I've always said this for many, many years, because Floyd was very reliant on reach. And although he had a longer reach than Khan, he was shorter than Khan. And he was a very crisp pot shot in counter puncher. He's got the best CompuBox stats, the last time I looked, in history of any champion. Now, since CompuBox began. In other words, if you're looking at it like goal difference, if you were to deduct punches landed from punches received that have been landed on you, he would have the best goal difference, punches difference, so to speak, in CompuBox history. Now, that's obviously an incredible achievement considering your position that he has fought consistently at such a high level. But Amir Khan, because he would fight long and he was fast of foot and hands, and Floyd's looking to counterpunch. Well, it's one thing to counterpunch a guy who's coming at you with mid-range hooks and he's fighting off of a pattern, the left followed by the right, followed by the left, and he'd be great at that with his shoulder roll. In the middle of the ring, he'd use that reach advantage to keep guys at range. He could walk them down. Floyd could do a bit of everything. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, he was a stunning fighter, but we're comparing elite to elite here. And Amir Khan would have been the sort of guy that would jump in with combinations of 3s and 4s and get out. Now, you could potentially time him with some crisp shots, just like Danny Garcia did. But Floyd doesn't hit that hard. He had hot hand issues. As he went through the weight categories, Floyd didn't hit that hard. To put it into perspective, if you ignore the Conor McGregor fight, because McGregor clearly couldn't pace himself, he got completely gassed and he got taken out late. He was making his boxing debut at the end of the day. He's a great fighter, but from a different style of fighting. So if we take that out for a second and we look at Floyd's career between 2007 until 2015, he had 10 fights. The only knockout he had was that Victor Ortiz knockout where Ortiz wasn't looking at him and he got sparked out when the referee said break, and he was telling him, and then he's telling him Ortiz off, and he told him to carry on fighting, and Ortiz was still chatting away to the ref. So the question is this: if Floyd couldn't knock out Amir Khan, and it's a bit of a myth that everyone that Amir Khan gets in the ring with sparks him clean out. That's a myth. He had been hurt by guys. Bradis Prescott, you can't even really count it. He was a youngster. It wasn't Amir Khan. But he fought the likes of Zab Judah, Lamont Peterson. Danny Garcia stopped him, but he fought Marcos Maidana. And the guys that knocked him out, forget Terence Crawford again, way past his best, completely washed up. Canelo Alvarez, monster puncher, much bigger man. So really, you're looking at Danny Garcia stopping him and Bradis Prescott when he was a youngster. So really, it's just Danny Garcia. Is it really? I mean, don't get me wrong. I know other guys dropped him and stuff like that. But the point is, if Floyd wasn't able to get him out of there, does he win the fight, or does he get outworked by a guy who throws eye-catching, blisteringly fast combination punches? Now, I know Devin Alexander isn't Floyd Mayweather, but you saw how a boxer like him got completely overwhelmed when he faced Amir Khan. Now, the reason I'm bringing Amir Khan up, regardless of whether Floyd would have won or not, I'm not saying he would have lost, but the reason I bring him up is because when Floyd put it out there as a poll as to who to fight next, and he asked the public to vote, they voted for Amir Khan, and instead he went on to fight Maidana twice, Andre Berto, he fought Robert Guerrero as well, all instead of Khan. Now, he's always been about the money, he says, money, Mayweather, and that's why he waited to fight Manny Pacquiao, he said, to make 300 million and so on and so forth. Well, the money fight there and the prestige fight would have been Amir Khan, but he didn't take that fight. A lot of people will look at that and they'll be critical of Floyd in that regard. What's your take on it? Other people will say, actually, that's a strength. It shows the ability to deconstruct an opponent, know your strengths and weaknesses at different points of your career, know what you're ready to take on and what you're not ready to take on. He deserves credit for that, not criticism. He deserves credit. Let me know what you think. What's your take on this? Number one, would Manny Pacquiao have a better legacy than Floyd Mayweather? Personally, I'll be honest with you, I'll put my cards on the table. I personally, me, with my character type, I would rather have Floyd Mayweather's career. I'd rather walk away and say, people can say whatever they want, nobody beat me. I always found the way. Other people will say, no. Look at the performances I put in as Manny Pacquiao. Look at the destructive force of nature that I was. Look how much the fans adore me. That tells you all you need to know. I'd rather have Manny Pacquiao's career. Let me know what you think on that basis. And the second question, oh yeah, well, those are the two questions. So who had the better legacy if Manny beats Spence? And number two, whose career would you rather have had? Thanks for watching, everyone. Take care. Chat to you soon. God bless.